I was one of many people who were surprised with the results of the primary election. Were you surprised at all?
You know, as I said at the time, I always expected it to be competitive. And I think, you know, I reminded people when I ran the first time in the primary, I squeaked by Jim Sullivan, and I was a distant second to Jeff Stone.
Right.
Yeah. And I'd been through enough elections in Milwaukee to never be too surprised about much of anything. But
so, did you think of it as a referendum on you and your 4 years or 5 years in office, or how did you interpret the vote?
Well, you know, it's hard to say why everybody who votes the way they do votes the way they do. I mean, you know, primaries, I think, tend in general to be participated in by people who are sort of more involved and self-identify around politics in general, and that's why the bigger numbers in the general election tend to, I think, include you know, a little less of that. But, you know, regardless, none of it really changes the fact that, you know, we're going to run a competitive race and, you know, game on, I guess.
You spent a couple $1 million before the primary, which was a pretty substantial amount of money compared to other races. Did you realize that it was going to be difficult that this was going to be a tight race between the two of you? Is that why you started spending so early and so heavily?
Well, I think it has more to do with the fact that in the last 5 years, we really haven't spent an awful lot of time or energy talking much about what we do. I spend a lot of time getting excited about what's next. Right. Sorry. Yeah. At the county, in terms of, you know, like a communication staff. I mean, you've been covering city and county for a long time. You know, we don't have the horses that the city does. Not that I begrudge them the horses. And also part of it is, you know, we don't. We'll probably have a slower tap on press releases, but the good news is I feel like there's an awful lot we've done, a lot of areas where we've made significant progress, you know, not just increasing, you know, and restoring services, but in some cases turning things that were getting worse to getting better. So there's a lot to talk about, not a lot of time to do it.
Most of you guys were very upbeat and positive. Mm-hmm. Will that change in the next 6 weeks?
Well, I would.
There wasn't much compare and contrast between you and Chris Larson.
I think most of what people hear today is a lot of negative. I mean, you know, everybody's watching the primaries right now. You know, you get a lot of instruction on who to be upset at and why, and there's no shortage of that. I mean, what we've been spending our time on in ads so far has been talking about a lot of the programs we do. And I know, because I hear from a lot of people, wow, I had no idea you were doing that. You should talk about that.
Right.
You know, that's part of what we're doing. And I think, you know, certainly now we're in a general, and there are contrasts between both of our approaches, both of our backgrounds. And I think, you know, I want to make sure that people have, you know, people can make the decisions and should make the decisions they want to make, but they should be informed decisions about the realities of our track record.
Last question about the campaigning part. Do you have a budget as to how much you will spend? I will spend no more than this much in the
No, I don't like to, with campaigns or really any other project, sort of rule in or rule out options. You know, I think most people know that about me. I mean, I'm distributively non-absolute for some people, but I like to stay flexible and never limit my ability to change or optimize a tactic.
Okay, so numbers out there saying you'll spend more than $5 million.
I will spend less than $1 billion.
So we narrowed it to less than $1 billion.
You've narrowed it to less than $1 billion.
Okay, I'll give you a chance now. You said you don't do very well in terms of publicizing the things you do. Mm-hmm. Tell me the three biggest accomplishments that you've had during your time in office.
I think one of the biggest, because it pertains to so much else, is when I ran, I said I was going to turn the fiscal direction of the county around and start lowering the debt load and liabilities. The reason I said it is the single biggest reason the county had been cutting services is that the debt and liability had gotten bigger. So what I mean by that is, you know, we'd run up the credit card. The debt service 5 years ago was about $1 million. So $112 million, it wasn't paying for any services, not salaries, not bus routes, not nothing, you know, just going to the credit card. by paying down debt and lowering liabilities, that number this year was about 60. And 60 million is still an awful lot of your money to be paying towards an old credit card bill, but it's 50 million a year better than what it was, and that's going to keep getting better. And that means that we have that much more to put back into services. So when people say, hey, this year in a budget, with the exception of the sheriff's budget request, I could take every department and division budget request and say, yeah, I can give you what you want. And for the first time, give the biggest raise we've given, add tuition reimbursement, no increase in healthcare. There's no way we could have done that years ago. But if people act and think that debt and liability don't have an impact on what we're able to do, that's why. So that's one. It was getting worse.
That's going to be exciting to accountants primarily. I mean, people aren't going to be able to work through all
I agree. It's not sexy stuff.
So number two, what's number two?
Number two, the Behavioral Health Division. Reform was hardly my idea. Reform, I mean, you guys were writing about it every week at least. I think you had 3 bylines: chronic crisis, patients in peril, and imminent danger, because the 2 were insufficient prior to that. Like, okay, got it. And yet, though,
sometimes you have to shout.
Sometimes you have to shout. Well, and frankly, I'm glad you did, because that was a big part of why finally we were able to get out finally and completely of the business of long-term care, where we were essentially warehousing people. I mean, people who hadn't been out of a facility in 20 years in some cases. We don't do that anymore. We're serving 14% more people. ER visits, which were going up, are going down. Involuntary detentions were going up, they're going down. We had deficit after deficit after deficit there. In the very first year after the law changed, we had a $10 million surplus, which is more to put into the community. I mean, none of that was happening before, and that's a big deal. There's a lot of things I'm proud of. I'm proud of the fact that number three. Oh, it's hard to narrow it down.
If I don't, you'll talk all afternoon.
I probably will, but that's because I've got a lot of good stuff. Well, okay, child support. Here's a department that collects about $100 million a year, generally for single moms bringing up kids. So, every single year since I've been elected, we've set and then broke the previous year's all-time record for the number of people we're serving. The second year, we decided we wanted to do a lot more than that. We wanted to do stuff for dads. Since then, we serve not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of dads. Job training, job placement, license recovery, and peer counseling to help re-engage with their kids. And then we just, this past year, we're re-upped on that grant. We got the largest federal grant for this program that's ever been given. We were the only one in the country to give it, and that's great because our good work's being recognized, but it's also, it's mostly great because we're serving a lot of people, and we're looking at a department and saying, we're not just doing what's mandated here, which is checks to single parents, and that's obviously important. We're doing more than that. We're doing stuff that empowers the dads and at least gives families a shot to both be stable and re-engage with kids.
So let's do some compare and contrast now. Mm-hmm. In your 5 years in office, you said you've held the line on property tax increases.
I've never introduced an increase in that property tax levy yet.
And it's been this way where you propose holding the line, the county board then increases it, and then the next year you keep it at the same level as the increase from the previous year, correct?
Well, there's one step in between. They increase it, and I veto the increases and try and explain why we don't need them.
So Chris Larson says this is a gimmick and game that you do, and that he's going to introduce realistic budgeting, and that he's going to propose budgets that are limited in most cases to the rate of inflation. And that if it's higher than the rate of inflation, he'll go to the public and explain why it should be higher than the rate of inflation. What do you think of his idea?
Well, I think when he was at the county, debt and deficit wasn't decreasing the way it is under my administration. When he was at the county, services weren't being restored. You can do both. And I guess one more point, Chris clearly has more experience being an elected official than I do. I'm lucky enough to have a lot more experience managing and being accountable for budgets and staff, being executive, and getting things done. That's why for 5 years I've always said, hold me accountable, but not for what I say I'm going to do, what I actually get done, which makes me very comfortable saying, hold all of us accountable.
So if you're elected for the next 4 years, will you stick to the same pattern where you do not propose an increase in the tax rate?
Well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to, as I said, we've dropped hundreds of millions off the liability, but there's more to go. The debt service is 112 down to 61. I'd like to get it all the way down to 0.
Right.
I'd like home run. We continue to increase and improve services, lower debt, and eventually lower taxes. I think we can.
You think you can in the next 4 years if you're elected?
I'm not sure in the next 4 years. It might be tricky, but we can get a hell of a lot closer.
But no increases during that time?
I don't think so.
Okay. Is that a pledge? You agree? I mean, I don't think so. It sounds a little squishy.
Well, right, but here's the thing. I don't think so from a guy who's never done it and has lowered debt every year, and the public policy firm who, they're not prone to hyperbole, said remarkable turnaround, would have been unthinkable. That was this year's assessment.
So it's not set in stone, but that's your goal, is not to do that.
That's my goal.
Chris Larson also told us today that he's proposing an increase in the sales tax from 5.6% to 6.6% to pay for parks, transit, local emergency services, and to provide property tax relief. This is there was an advisory referendum on this in 2008, and he was one of the leaders on that, and says it's regrettable that we didn't pass it then and shift the financial obligation from the property taxes to the sales tax. Would you go along with something like this, or would you reject it?
Well, I mean, the first issue before you even get to that is somewhat academic. I mean, until the state changes the law, which would have to happen to allow us to do this, it's not even a possibility. I mean, your job as executive is to build plans not based on the reality you'd like to see. Mm-hmm. You have to build on the reality that is. That doesn't mean you can't work towards that, but I'm not going to base plans on something that until law changes, I won't work. And if he is going to change state law to do it.
He says he will go to Madison and lead the fight to get this changed.
Well, yeah, so it's probably fair. I said when I ran for office 5 years ago, I was going to lower debt. I did. I said I was going to reform behavioral health division. I did. I said I was going to stop raising fares and stop cutting routes of transit. I've never done it. Has Chris been able to get a lot of legislation passed? I think one of his complaints, it seems like with me, is that I'm insufficiently angry at Republicans. I'm willing to freely admit that I have a lot of Republicans who I'm proud to call friends. I don't have a compelling need to hate people I disagree with, but functionally important. Right now, the Republicans have a significant majority in the Senate and a significant majority in the Assembly and the governorship. Right. And the time that Senator Larson has been in Madison, that's increased. And whatever else you think of it, it seems unlikely to me that the group that put in the law that makes the sales tax illegal is going to, for Chris Larson, say, just kidding, we're going to change it. It's independent of the merits of it.
Right. So this seems like an unrealistic proposal or idea to fund for parks in Milwaukee County.
And as an elected official who is essentially promising the citizens of Milwaukee, I'm going to make plans and follow through on plans that I think are responsible and can work. I think it's important for us not to make promises that are unlikely to be able to be carried out. I mean, again, when you ask me, okay, is it a pledge to not raise taxes for 4 years? I can't guarantee, that's certainly what I want to do. I can't guarantee I'll never have to, but I can point to the last 5 years of what I've gotten done. When Chris Larson says, I'm going to change state law and get Republicans in the Assembly and the Senate to agree to let me increase the sales tax, it's just as reasonable for you and everyone else to say, well, how's that legislation been going for you the last couple of years in Madison?
Larson and some of your critics have focused on what they say is a power grab by you, that you've worked with Republicans in the legislature, helped push through Act 14, and you've had some other proposals go through, and there's talk right now about a bill that would allow biennial budgets. Are there other reforms that you would like to see the legislature make that would consolidate more power in the county exec's office?
Well, first, power grab, I think, it's a catchy phrase, and I've heard Senator Larson use it. Well, of course you like it. But I don't think it's terribly accurate. I mean, first, the bill that created the Mental Health Board won. It was voted on, like 122 to 2, including by Senator Larson. And that was anything but a power grab. It takes one of the biggest divisions at county and removes a whole bunch of the management from my office or wherever is county exec. The goal, though, wasn't more power. The goal was what I was just talking about, which is ER visits are down. We're closed long-term health care. We got a 10 million surplus instead of deficits, fewer involuntary detentions. We're serving more people and doing it better. Similarly, I pushed for an elected comptroller. If I wanted more power, I would have pushed for, hey, I hire the comptroller. I think, I can't remember, I think Senator Larson was actually against that, but generally when you're creating an elected position, that's devolving power.
Right.
I'm not really clear on what exactly the goal would be on the sort of power grab
there
narrative.
There are things that you have more authority over certain appointments, certain increases, certain contracts. You have more power than you used to have. And then these land sales that have become an issue. You do have more authority in certain areas. In those that you mentioned, you don't. And you requested that.
Sure. Well, though, if you look at
The power to sell
any
the
one of
airport.
those,
I mean,
that actually is one where I know this was PolitiFacted, but I think there maybe a certain fact was overlooked. You have covered, the Journal has, that in order for us to sell even the old transit center down where Fort the Couture is, we need the approval of the Department of Transportation. And the airport receives all airports do, a ton of federal funding. And I'm not fully convinced I could just sort of waltz in and say, hey, yeah, I sold it, and send a memo to Washington. I have a funny feeling I'd be hearing. But regardless, all of the power grab metaphors have seemed like a big metaphorical Death Star without any actual motive. I've yet to see, or sort of a backstory of to what end, why. I mean, I get it makes a great headline. I too would be concerned about somebody who wanted to.
Easier for you.
Well, but the other part of it is on contracts. A lot of good government practice, and I mean, you don't have legislators voting on specific contracts or electeds. Me too. When we have contracts, we're doing vetting. I don't want to know who the vendors are, who's proposing. I don't even want to know who's on the panel. Our job is to make sure the process is independent. I mean, the goal for all of this, just like the mental health bit, has never been about power grab. It's been about good government.
So, you still support the biennial budgets proposal, and do you expect that to pass the legislature?
I don't know. I mean, I'll certainly. It's something I still continue to think is a good idea. And the idea is other counties do it. The state's biennial, so we would track their budget. And biennial budgets in general, they allow you to plan more. They allow you to build up reserves, which in a way we can't do.
And debt certification, you support that as well?
Oh, you mean with the
bill that would allow the state to
the state debt collection program? Yeah. Well, that sort of separate. I mean, that was in the arena bill. The reason I was comfortable with that final iteration before Senator Larson, asked to pull it out. Was because, yes, you had the county committing to an expense, but you also had a revenue. And we had spent a ton of time, we didn't guess, with the State Department of Revenue, and we looked at the 100+ municipalities in this state that use the state debt collection, DPI.
You're still supportive of that, right?
Oh, yeah. Because absent that, people should be concerned about that, because until we address that, there's a $4 million a year hole, because when Senator Larson pulled out the state debt collection, he left in this obligation. And so this year our budget includes $4 million that I would much rather have put back toward services. So yes.
A few questions from readers that have been sent in for you. Most of them a little shorter than the ones we've been discussing so far. If elected, would you serve the full 4-year term?
Yeah, I can't imagine not, yeah.
Would you, I guess they're asking, would you run for governor in 2018?
Oh,
Someone pointed out in this note that TIA has bought the domain names for Abele for Wisconsin.net and KingAbele.net. What is the reason for having done that?
Probably to prevent someone else from doing it.
Okay, so KingAbele.net, taken. No one else can get that.
Right.
Do you regret voting vetoing the living wage proposal?
What I vetoed was the fact that the living wage proposal was going to cost, not my opinion, the independently elected comptroller's opinion, $28 million from family care, which serves the frail and elderly. The point I made when I vetoed, because I didn't just veto, I said this publicly, I have a statement, you can go, anyone can go check. My concern was what I vetoed was the idea of pulling 28 million people, $28 million from the frail and elderly. Things need to be sustainable. If I told you I had $1,000 in the bank and I'm going to start you off at $100 a week, that'd be great for the first 10 weeks, but after that it wouldn't. What I like is the highest wage that we can sustainably afford. I like a federal minimum wage. That makes a lot of sense. I've supported it.
But the answer is no, you don't regret vetoing it.
I don't regret vetoing the bill that included that because I wanted to protect family care.
Now that Martin O'Malley's out of the race, who are you backing for president?
I haven't made a decision yet, but not because I haven't gotten calls. I mean, literally within an hour of when he dropped out.
That's because you got the seats right behind them.
Yes, I know.
So,
right.
I
felt like Paul Ryan, by the way, like I don't have a reaction shot one way or the other.
So questions. Are you leaning one way or the other?
Probably leaning Hillary.
Okay. And when will you make a decision on that?
I'm not sure.
Do you think you'll ever be able to mend your relationship with Sheriff Clark?
I would love to.
Can you answer that in 30 seconds?
I would love to have a great relationship with Sheriff Clark. I'd try to have the best relationship I can with anybody. I'm never going to say I'm perfect at it, but I'm going to always try. And if somebody's got the sort of magic,
not like you.
I have noticed that.
And it seems like you're not particularly fond of him.
Well, there's a very significant difference. I don't put out press releases or public statements that have name calling in them, and I don't. I haven't sued him. He's done that with me. That's his right. But he's spending your money to do it.
Is there anything you can do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, who would you say has the best relationship with him that I could learn from?
Besides Charlie Sykes and Vicki McKenna?
Aside from that.
Who in public life he would get along with? I don't know. He's
I ask because I would love to figure it out. I mean, I would love to have, there's a lot of great people in the department I know because I work with them, and I'll do what I can.
You don't see him getting involved in your race with Chris Larson, do you?
No, it's hard to imagine. Maybe.
Okay.
I'd say no, except that the sheriff has occasionally surprised all of us.
Yes. We haven't talked about the Mitchell Park Dome. Someone wants to know, would you be in favor of tearing them down under any circumstance? And if not, how are you going to pay for the $75 million? You say it costs, Larson says it's $45 million. So how would you pay for it if you don't tear them down?
Yeah, well, if we don't tear it down, it would probably be a while. I mean, one thing is because over the last few years we've been both reducing the amount of buildings we have to put capital financing in. We've also paid down debt, so we've got a bit more room for capital that I don't like to borrow. If we decided as a community, hey, look, we want to do domes again for the next 50 years, we'd probably come up with, as I generally try to, whatever the most sustainable way we could do. I'll tell you one thing, right now we lose about $1.2 million a year just operating them. I mean, it's expensive. You have glass domes called Tropical, and it's in Milwaukee.
Open to the idea of tearing them down.
Well, in what won't surprise you, and it will be a theme, I try not to ever limit my ability to improve a plan. What I like to do is, whatever we do, things that work, that are sustainable, that serve the public. When the domes replaced the Victorian Conservatory that was there before, I'm sure there was plenty of people who bemoaned the loss of the Victorian Conservatory and saw these new modern McDonald's-y domes as, it was, heresy. I'm sure there were some people who did, right or wrong, and I'm sure whatever we do, if it's changed, there'll be people who will be nostalgic about what was. To me, we just built 2 years ago a lot of wonderful new efficient greenhouses. In fact, that's where the county board had their hearing on the domes. To me, the most important thing is whatever we do there, it serves people. It's what the public and the community wants to see there. And then within that context, it's the most sort of sustainable and efficient.
Just help me clarify. You were saying that you wanted something sustainable. You're talking about a sustainable revenue source to pay for if you do repair the domes, or what are you talking about?
Well, at a minimum, I said before, they're about 1.2 million a year we lose to operate them. So if nothing else, even if we decided we were going to do the domes, there's a lot, technology's come a long way. Geothermal's a lot further. I would look for, okay, what can we do to reduce operating costs? What can we do if we're going to start planning again? Are there things that we can do that maybe account for sort of more earned revenue? It's event space now, but if we knew event space was going to be part of it going forward, let's not guess.
So how open are you to tearing them down?
You know, it's the same thing.
Is it a realistic option?
It's a realistic option. Put it this way: if the public says, "Hey, we don't want to spend, on the finite box of funding we have, we don't want to spend on this $75 million," then I'm not going to tell them they're wrong.
Chris Larson says the figure is actually $45 million. Is he just wrong on that?
Well, I don't know where he's getting his numbers from. I know that our numbers are based on essentially a dollar-adjusted estimate that Grafe did. I think you guys have covered this. The domes have had maintenance issues for years.
Right.
I think the initial designer of them would have probably told you, hey, they won't last forever. The glass they use in there isn't made anymore. There's over 10,000 panes of glass, so it's a very technically difficult thing to replicate.
So, well, thank you very much for coming in.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
And that's it today for JS on Politics.